Okay, so you can't hear me. Good. So let me recap for the last minute that I've been talking with no one hearing me. That's fine. So this is the first in a series of webinars we're going to do. I'm not exactly sure how often they're going to be. It is going to be in English. I am trying to talk English. You've got the chat window there. You can leave comments as we go through. I'll try and answer any questions as we go through. You've got my various details on the screen here if you need to get in touch or see any of the blog posts I do. Any way of keeping up to date, you can get through this. The basic scope for this is what I wrote on the website. We're going to create a project as we go through, coding as we go. I'm going to use Tracks as the application under test, which is an open source application. I'm going to analyze the application as we go through, showing you how I use Firebug, writing the code as we do it. I'll be talking about the code and the decisions I make as we go through. So I'm not sure how far we're going to get through in each one of these webinars. So we'll just see how we get on. And it is being recorded for future use. So if you can't hear it now, hopefully it's coming through in the recording when you do see it. I don't know exactly when the next one is, so if you do want to keep up to date, sign up to the mailing list on the website, and I'll let you know when the recordings are as well. So let's get started. Now the issue I have here is that I have a fairly large screen, so I have a tiny shared window up here, and I have to move everything out of the way. So I don't know how many of you actually use Bitnami, but I like Bitnami because they have available virtual machines, and if anyone can't hear me, by the way, for technical issues with this, I'm not going to be resolving them online. So if anyone can't hear me at the moment and other people can, I'm going to assume it's a problem on your end, and you're going to have to just watch the recording. Of course, if you can't hear me, then you won't hear that statement. So I'm using Bitnami. I've got it installed locally. I've installed it as on a virtual machine, and we're going to use Tracks as the application. I'm just going to write a chat here. Yep, I'm just going to here. Okay, so the way this works is Tracks, when it installs, has a default user called user, and I think the password I created is password. Good, so this is Tracks. It's an open source application for getting things done, for creating tasks, various other things. Now, I don't think we're going to get very far in this particular session automating Tracks, and we'll probably only have a chance to capture the login process. The reason I picked this is that it has some fairly simple, but it also has some Ajax elements where when you create things, they'll show up in the list. There's various drop-downs. All of these things later on will prove a hassle when we try and automate them. So the first thing I'm going to do, clearly, because we're doing automation, is to create a new project. I'm using IntelliJ. I'm just going to create a new Maven module. Call this webinar. And there we go. So here's the normal IntelliJ window. I'm just going to try and resize this so it fits in with the tiny shot. So now I've got a completely blank project with the standard Maven detail. Now I use a fairly standard template for this stuff, so I'm just going to copy it in, and then I'll talk through that a little bit. Now I have practiced this in advance, but it doesn't mean everything's not going to go pear-shaped. So I don't need the cucumber yet. So what I've just done there is I've pasted in a bunch of dependencies. So I've brought in Hamcrest 1.3 and JUnit 4.11. I've brought in Selenium 2.28, and I've brought in the Opera driver, because that's really all I need. Now anyone that's wondering how I know what to paste in here, all I ever do is go off to the Maven repository, do a search for the tool that I want to install in my application. Then it will show me the actual dependency code to put into my source repository. So you can see Hamcrash, JUnit, Selenium, Opera. And that's all downloaded its dependencies, so theoretically I'm working now. So the first thing I'm going to do, because I know that I am going to be working with the Tracks application, I don't even need to do any analysis on that application before I start, because I know that I'm going to need the concept of a domain object. I'm going to need the concept of a Tracks account that is going to help me do this. So I'm going to create that now. So this is pretty much the way I start. I start modeling the application and how I think I'm going to use it. I'm going to create a Tracks account class, and you can see that I'm putting that in the main package. I haven't put that, or in the main source folder. I haven't created a package for this yet. I'll do that later on. I'm just making it default just now. I'm pretty much coding the way that I code in the real world, and it's fairly crude and clumsy, and I refactor as I go. I pretty much just put the basics up and running to start with. So I know that for my Tracks account, I'm going to want to have a username and password. So I'm going to start with create a constructor. I'm going to have a username. But what I want to do is, because at some point this is probably going to be in continuous integration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that when I do put it into my version control system and I do come through continuous integration, that I'm not going to have the username and password in my source code. So I'm going to go initially straight off to the environment properties to get the username. Now clearly at this point, I haven't even added this into the property. So I'm going to have to give it a default. And I know that the default password I've set on my test environment is called user. My default user is user. So you can see here I've got a couple of variables that don't actually exist yet. I'm going to create a field called username. And I'm going to create a starting narrator, webinar, /user, excellent. I assume that sound is coming through everybody. There we go. Good, exiting narrator. That was enjoyable. So I'm going to create a constant called Tracks username key. I'm going to add that up there. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically just setting this up. I'm kind of future-proofing this because I know I'm going to have to do it. So what this is basically saying now is, I am assuming that when I go into continuous integration or when I go into another environment, I'm going to force someone to create an environment property called Tracks username that will have the actual username for that environment. Because I'm running it locally, I'm going to default it to user, which is the one that I know. That way, it's only going to be on my local machine. If anyone does get hold of the source code, it's probably not going to work on their environment because my test environment is completely local to me. So let's do the same for the password. I know that was password as a default. Now, I don't know how many people start with their domain objects, but this is how I start. So I made a mistake there, creating that as a local variable. So let's move that out. And now let's create this static Now, because I don't have these in my environment variables, that's fine. It's just going to work with the defaults. It's not going to throw any errors, so I don't have any problems. Really, I should restructure these into this order, and later passing when we stick on various other static checkers. So the only other thing I'm going to add in here is I'm going to add in the Tracks URL. Now it's debatable whether this should be in my Tracks account, but I'm sticking it in here at the moment because this is the only class that I've got. And I'm running this on a virtual environment. So let me copy paste this URL in here. Again, let's create these. Okay. Okay, so we've got no compile errors on there. Everything currently is private, so when I try to use it, that will be a problem. So what I could do, and what most people do when they're coding, is make accessors and getters on this. I'm going to be particularly lazy because I'm just starting up. I'm just going to make all of this public. Now, it's debatable whether you should do this or not, and you should force accessors in. Now, really, the accessors and getters will make it much easier to extend later on, but because I'm making it final and I'm creating it in the constructor, I am just going to make it public for now. And I will take the pain when I refactor it later, because I'm just trying to get started and just trying to get up and running quickly. So we now have a domain object that I can use in my test. So what I think I'll do is I think I'll create a package for this. Let's call this tracks. So I'm creating a package for my domain objects. I'm going to move that in there. All right, good. So now let's have a quick look at the site we're going to test. So where did that window go? There we go. I'm going to log out, because before I can do anything in this application, I need to figure out how to log in. We can see that my login URL is tracks login. So I've already put in a domain in my app that I'm now going to need to add tracks/login for it. So let me log in and see what happens. So I've gone here now. Let's see what happens when I hit that main URL. So 800 tracks login. What happens if I just go to tracks? So I'm just trying to figure out what page ops actually I do. So even if I just go straight into tracks, it will redirect into login. Or I can go straight to login. So I know that I'm going to need to mess around with these fields. So I've got Firebug installed, and it was clearly used on a bigger screen. So I Firebug when I'm in Firefox to see the various IDs, because the built-in tools, if I inspect this with inspect element, I don't think these tools are as good. If I click the HTML part, I don't like the built-in ones. I like to use Firebug. So I can see here that the user field has got an ID called user_login, and the password, user_password. So that's fine. And there's a login button, which has no ID, but it has a name for login, so we'll probably use that. And the title of the page is tracks::login, so I can use that to check whether I'm on the right page or not. Let's see what happens when I do log in, because at the moment we have to survey and model the site that we're actually testing. So once I do log in, the title changes to tracks list, and I'm back on the normal tracks URL. So I can only get to this URL with a valid page if I'm actually logged in, otherwise it redirects. And I've got the presence of a logout, so let's see what that is. href tracks logout, so there's an anchor with logout. So that's probably good enough to let me automate the login process. So the way I'm going to do that is by creating a basic test. So over here in test, I'm going to create a new package for this. Let's do com.tester.webinar.track. Now I'm not used to talking out loud when I code like this, so that's an interesting experience for me. So I'm going to call this the login package. I'm going to put my initial test in here because I'm going to have a login. So let me create a new class, and let's just call it login test. Call it login test. All right. So I start pretty basic. Oops, too basic. Escape, get rid of that. Public void. And I'm going to say login to track. So I'm going to create a very horrible looking test to start with. Didn't want to do that. I want to create it. What I do want to do is bring in the jar. Okay, so I've done something fundamentally stupid at this point. Let's get that out of the way. Now, what do people normally do under these circumstances? Well, sometimes I just close the project and start again. So let's do that. No. Okay, I think I missed a little thing saying automatically pull in all the dependencies that we need. So I think that's the wrong one. Yeah. I do need to bring in JUnit, but I've got it in the POM. So let's bring up Maven. Let's do a refresh on it. Let's do a import class. So just because the Maven stuff hadn't taken its dependencies, and it was I think the refresh and the re-import that actually allowed me to do that without any hassle. So the reason also is for doing this live is so that you can see all the kind of idiotic simple mistakes that we make when we're doing this. Right, so I've now got JUnit in there. I've now got the login to track test. So the first thing I have to do, because we're using WebDriver, is create a driver. I'm going to use the Firefox one. Let's bring these things in. Good. So because we've got a domain object for the tracks, I'm going to create that. Now, we know that we have to get that page that we're going to log in. So I've got in my domain object a base URL for the application for the test environment that we're working in. And I know that in order to log in, because we just surveyed the site, I have to go to the tracks login page. Then I know, because we surveyed the site, that I need something to represent the user login field. And that's a web element, because everything in web driver on the page is a web element. Now this may all be particularly basic for some of you, but when we set this up, I promised that I was going to start from scratch and explain everything as I went through. So let me import this. Right, so now, theoretically, if this worked, and you can read the code, so if I'm writing something and you're reading the code and you see something wrong, scream out through the chat, otherwise we'll encounter it when I try and run the test. Let's create another web element to represent the password. Now you can see that I'm not starting with any page objects or anything like that. What I'm doing is starting by putting everything in the tests directly, because the way that I work is to just create tests and refactor. I move things out into other objects and classes when I see a need for it, when the modeling approach behind that is what seems really important. I also need a button to click so that I can log in. And what we saw when we saw the site was there was no ID for it. We're using the name. So I'm starting with very simple, just using the easy out-the-box commands in WebDriver to do the buys. I'm not using any custom buys, not using any basic synchronization in here. And then I know that for this user login page, for this user login field, I need to send the keys to allow me to log in. And my login, my username is in the domain object. Then, presumably, I also have to do a very similar thing for the password. And that, again, is in my domain object. Now we need to click the button. Now, all of this, if you haven't used WebDriver before, is pretty obvious and pretty readable. What we're doing is we've got a driver object, which is an abstraction of the browser. We find elements, because everything is a web element. Then we use those web elements, and we've got all the various methods that sit on the back of that. Send keys, click is displayed, various other things. So that is the basic process that we need to log in. So what I'm going to do now is I'll create an assert. I'm going to assert that. So I'm using the hamcrest matchers straight off. So I want to check that the title is it was tracks : list tasks. Now, really, what I should have done there is copy it from the page. So I've done that from memory. I'm doing a static import from hamcrest for the assert that. Then I will pull in the static import from the hamcrest core matchers for is. So now I've got an assert that says, check that the title of the current page that we've just should have been taken to on the back of this click is tracks list tasks. And because I typed this in by hand, there's a risk that I got this wrong. I'm prepared to accept that risk and carry on. But in other circumstances, what I would probably do is go into the page itself and copy and paste it. But because the speed that we're doing here, I'm typing this stuff in. So then I need to log out. So I've done an assert. I know I'm on the right page. I don't have to mess about. So now I'm just going to do driver.get and the tracks.tracks URL, and we want the logout. Now, this is probably not what some people would have done, right? Because here what I'm doing is I am going directly to the login page. So I'm just getting the login page. I'm not clicking on the logout link on the page. I'm going directly to the logout page and getting it. So that's partly because when we analyzed the page, we saw that it was just an anchor hitting that page. So I'm bypassing that anchor link, just in case for whatever reason things don't work on the site. So here, theoretically, I have got a test that should log in, check that we can log in, check that the title is correct, and should log out and quick. So questions we might have are, do I need to put any synchronization in place? So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to run this manually. Let's see if it actually works. I'm going to put a breakpoint here, left click on this breakpoint, then I'm going to debug this test. So debug login to tracks. Now I typically debug my tests when I start because it helps me check whether they're working, and I can do it without synchronization. So there's it in the background. Again, I'm going to shuffle things about so you can see it now because of the tiny screen area. This is going to be a little bit fiddly over here. So we're now about to get the page. And then I'm going to step over. So we've got that page, I can see that. Now I'm going to find the username. Didn't pose any problems, so it's found that element, find the password, find the button, send the keys, it's typed in the username, send the password, it's typed that in, I'm going to click the button, login unsuccessful. So that's good in the sense that something bad happened. So the cert then should fail. Let's check. Console. So the test failed, which is not what we expected, but it's good that the test failed, because we should always start with failing tests, as we're told, when we're doing test-driven development. So let's investigate why that failed. Passwords. Look at that. Brilliant. So now I'm just going to run that test because I've seen in debug that the basic mechanism works. So I'm just going to run that test and see if it actually passes. So let me close that browser down because I skipped that part of the test. Let's run that. See, I didn't see anything in the chat window that said, Alan, you've typed in the password wrong. You guys are supposed to be reviewing my code as we do it so that we don't get those mistakes. So I don't know if you noticed there, because it was in a big window, the site did come up. We did see the final screen there. All the tests have passed. We did manage to log in. We have a passing test. So we are already half an hour in. And my plan was to spend half an hour to 45 minutes on. Thanks for the review, Brian. We plan was to spend half an hour to 45 minutes. I'm going to push this forward to 45 minutes so we get to see a little bit more than just the most basic test. All right. Now, we ran it in debug. It worked fine. We ran it there. It passed. So I don't think I need any synchronization in here. Later on, I may need to add additional synchronization around finding the keys, waiting for the page to load, waiting until I've actually typed in passwords and usernames. But at the moment, it does not appear like I need any additional synchronization in here, which is good for the first webinar because I don't have to go into any details about the weights. So let's now refactor this test because this is an ugly thing. We've got everything going on in here. So I am going to, what shall I do? I know. Let's take these out. We've got plain strings in here. What we really want to do is refactor these into constants. So I'm going to go let the tracks login URL. And let's refactor this into a constant as well. So I'm kind of just looking for what Now you probably can't see this because it's off the screen. Let me move this up. Can't move it up because I don't have enough padding. Now this current window that you guys can see is a quarter of my current monitor space. So this is fiddly. Let's refactor this and extract this out. Again, you can't see it. Okay, trust me, I'm doing the normal refactor, extract into constant, which I could do with a Control-Alt-C, but I was showing you the menus. Right, so what else could we do in here? So I could, because I'm building this URL up, I could actually refactor this into a string, but I'm just going to leave that as it is, I think. What else could I do? I could allocate some variables in here so that this starts looking like a page object. I could start adding in some comments into this. Yes, so why didn't I just refactor that out into a single constant? Actually, we haven't done it yet. So the first thing I've done is push this out because this tracks login URL. I've moved it up the top here. This doesn't really seem like something that belongs in a test, right? This seems like it belongs in some sort of page object or site object somewhere. Now, the fact that I'm getting it with the full thing here, again, probably looks like it should be somewhere else. So what I will do is I'm going to refactor this out. I'm not going to refactor out into a constant. The first thing I'm going to do is just refactor this out into a string because I'm not sure where else I'm going to use it. And one of the questions you always have when you're doing this is how far do you go and where do you put things? But it's quite obvious that building up strings doesn't make it readable. But where do I put this? At the moment, this is, I've only got one test. So I'm just going to put this building the string in here, but it will make it easier to refactor out into other objects later on. What I'm also going to do to make this readable is I'm going to move these out. So I'm going to create a by for that. And then I'm just going to put this in here. So because the bys actually return objects, I'm going to put them into their own objects and make this test a little bit more readable, or I think it's more readable. And it makes it a bit more obvious that I'm going to be extracting all this stuff out into page objects at some point. And you can actually see the page object starting to form in front of us just by the reorganization of these elements. I'm partly doing this to make it readable because I don't like all the nested brackets or whatever else in there. But I'm also doing it because I'm creating these as reusable objects. What else we got? Let's do the sign-in button as well. There it is. So we've moved out the login URL. We've got the bys in here. That's a little bit more readable. What else could we do to refactor this? What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move, I'm going to add some comments in here. So this is the get tracks details. This is the page locators. Now, I'm actually going to add in a WebDriver wait because I don't really trust that the thing is going to load. So after I've logged in, yep, I'll try and make the code available. I'll create a public repository or something for this and stick all the code out there. So we go to the page. So the page locators, I don't actually need them here. The page locators are in the setup stuff, so I'm going to stick that here. And then we can see that I'm doing a whole bunch of setup work. Then I'm now doing stuff. So I've moved my setup stuff at the top. And you can start to see, you can probably start to see how I would refactor this stuff out now. Because at some point I'm going to need to extract this out into some method called goToLogin page that I will put somewhere. And it will no longer be in the test looking like this. So I'm now going to wrap around this. So this is really login to the app. Now I could put in a make sure page is loaded type function, but we've seen that we don't really need that yet. And then I'm going to say, so this is the actual login process. This is type login details. No, it isn't. That's actually just setting up the page controls. So this might well be done on a page object model in the constructor, and this is actually doing stuff. Then we've got check that we're logged in. Then we've got log out, and then we've got quit driver. So by putting in these comments, I'm partitioning out my test into what I think it's doing, which helps me identify what methods I'm going to need in other objects. So before we do anything else, let's make better use of JUnit. Now at the moment we only have one test, right? But I can see that before, what I really want to do is, this has nothing to do with the test, right? Creating a Firefox driver has nothing to do with the test. I should just have one there available for me. So what I'm going to do is move that into a JUnit setup. I'm going to try and do this quickly because I think we're going to stop in about 5 minutes. Let's see if we can get further. So that's public void. But what I should be doing is start driver. And I want to do this in the before class because I want to do this once for the class. So sorry if this is confusing, but that's how I think. So before class happens once per class. It happens at the start, and because it happens through reflection and it happens at the class level, this needs to be static. So in the start driver, I'm going to pull this out so that the WebDriver is available for all of my tests. I've only got one test at the moment, but it's going to be available for all of my tests because I'm clearly going to write some more in here. I need to push the WebDriver driver object at the top. So everything should be available after this webinar. The recordings, the videos, the code. Right, so now what we've done is, before the class happens, any method that's in here will have a driver available to it because this happens once per class. Now, all the classes, I suspect that this is something that I'm pretty much I'm going to do pretty much every test. So I'm going to say before I'm going to create that account because I only have one account set up. So I may as well use this in here. Again, this needs to be declared up here. That doesn't need to be public, it can be private. Now, creating the driver is only ever going to happen once in the class. Before every test, I'm going to set up the tracks account that I'm going to use. And clearly, after every test, I'm going to want to log out. So let's put after. Prove that out. So now my test doesn't even have to worry about logging out or tidying up after itself, because we're going to do all of that in the JUnit abstractions. So tracks does not need to be static because it's in the before and after methods. It only needs to be static if it's in the before class and after class. Because the before class, before class, and after class are all accessed via reflection. But because it's a class method, that before class and after class, it has to be accessed on a static basis, because it's at a class level, not a class instance level. Let's quit the driver and pull this in. Now, theoretically, I can get rid of that comment because that's what I called the method. Right, so I don't see any red bars on the side, so even though that was done fairly quickly, I'm hoping it's pretty much worked. And now our test should be a little bit more, we don't have a lot of this set up. Now, the reason I haven't moved the tracks login out yet is because this is only being used in here. Page locators, again, are only being used in here. This is only used in here. But you can see that I've structured it in a way that looks like it will probably get moved out into a certain object. And I think we're probably going to have to wind up there because we've done 45 minutes. We didn't get onto refactoring the page objects. So things that we have covered that if you're new to this, you should probably look up. Have a look at JUnit on junit.org. Do a search for hamcrest. Have a look at the at before class, at before, at after class methods, all these annotations that we've used. I suspect that next time we come through, what I'll be doing is I'll be starting to refactor this into page objects, so this particular method, so I can reuse them. All of these things will move into a login page object in the constructor and be available. This possibly go into a navigator. This will probably go into the page object class. And then I have to decide whether I create a login method on the page object or whether I do it differently. But that was a very, very brief overview. So since we said we're going to stay for 45 minutes, I'm pretty much going to stop there. Let me show you the final slide. If any of you want to stay on for another 15 minutes or so, I will respond to questions in the chat. For those of you that are heading off, because we scheduled this for the 45 minutes, they join the mailing list. You'll probably find that if you just go onto seleniumsimplified.com, you should see this in the main blog post. So the basic links are seleniumsimplified.com. That's where you'll find most of this stuff. If you haven't done anything with Udemy, haven't set up your IDE or anything like that, sign up to the basic WebDriver course, which is free. If you want to know the Web API in more detail, because I'm covering it through these webinars very, very quickly, then we've got the main WebDriver course. I will probably send out an email to everyone on the this call with the details of that. So for those of you that are heading off after the 45 minutes, I hope that was useful. I hope you heard it, and I hope you'll turn up for the next ones because we will do more refactoring at that point. But you can see that getting started with this, it takes quite a long time just to get the basics of automation going. And we have to investigate the application as we're doing. And the main point I think I wanted to get across here was I start very, very simply. I build it up in pieces. I restructure in situ, then I refactor out into other classes. So for those of you who are heading off, thank you very much. For those of you that are still staying, I will monitor this chat window, and you can see I will respond to any of the questions as they come through. So there's the Tracks account, as one of the questions for that was. So any other questions for this? So thank you for all the thank yous, and I'll happily respond to any questions. So I will release the code. Everyone on this thing, because you signed up with your email address, I will email you out all the details for where the recording will be, how to get access to the source codes, things like that.